research and host conversations such as this on topical issues affecting Kenya's economy, and to try to trace how policy change may be used to expand prosperity for Kenyans through the expansion of economic and political freedoms. So in the last year, the IE has been carrying out a series of conversations, webinars, among them basically to raise public understanding of key issues in order to allow for the formation of, in order to allow for people to elevate the quality of debate and issue-based politics over time in Kenya. Now, this is our fourth conversation in the series, but specifically the second conversation for the IEA this year. And today we'd like to discuss the question of Kenya's public debt, which is not only salient, but it is one that Kenyans deal with almost every single day based on the evidence that we see in the supply of public services that has been reduced, the quality of public services, and obviously questions related to how government manages the excellent revenue collection records that we see being broken every year. So we have two colleagues today who will be presenting on the persistent Kenyan deficits, which have led to a public debt level that all Kenyans are concerned about, and which the Cabinet Secretary, together with Parliament, keep mentioning that is being resolved through a fiscal consolidation path. I have two colleagues, Winnie and who's the Prime Program Officer in our Futures program, together with Assistant Program Officer Jairus Kidogo, and be taking us through what are Kenya's options. And they'll start, the conversation is split into two areas. The first is basically a definition of terms and to state what the options are. And then we'll talk about Kenya's realities, basically based on what options exist for fiscal consolidation. But then the second part will be just to say, knocking Kenya's economic and fiscal policy realities and their outcomes. What is the absolute path? I mean, the appropriate path. And after that, there'll be conclusions, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Each of them will have 20 minutes for the section of the presentation. So I hope by about 11:45, we'll have a question and answer. Now, just before I go to her, I'd like to inform you that we record these conversations, and the reason for recording these conversations is for archival purposes and for reference by those who are unable to attend at this time. But at the same time, therefore alert you that these conversations are recorded. They'll be placed on the archive, so you can look at part of it in reference. If for any reason you do not wish to appear, then please let us know, so that in the recording, that portion that covers your face and credentials may be blocked out. But you're reminded that this is a public conversation. We consider it a public conversation, and we conduct it with appropriate rules at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which means that we'll respect your opinions and also respect, to the extent possible, your requirement for confidentiality and all that. But the subject that we're discussing requires a broader public conversation, so whatever views are expressed here will be considered views that are placed in the public domain for anybody's reference. So without further ado, I thank you all again for being here. I invite my colleague Winnie to start the conversation, and she has 20 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Sorry about that. So thank you, Kwame, for the introduction and for and to our guests, thank you so much for joining. So as Kwame has indicated, our conversation today is around debt. And we've been having debt conversations, but today's conversation is important and it matters because, as we will be showing you, Kenya faces persistent fiscal pressures and rising public debt, which has economic and development implications. And then we will be showing you different budget positions that a country can choose. And these different budget choices affect growth, inflation, service delivery, and inequality. So as you will be seeing again from our presentation is we are trying to show you that the debt conversation, the debt debate is not only technical, but it is political and social, because there are political, it is as a result, it is a political consequence, and it also has social consequences. So at the end of this conversation, we hope to answer the question on what fiscal stance best supports Kenya's development today. So let's dive into understanding the different budget options. So Kenya could, or countries can choose to have a balanced budget. And in having a balanced budget, it therefore means that we have in having a balanced budget, it just means that revenues, our expenditures and revenues are at par. So the revenue collected and the matches the expenditure. And then if a country is having a budget deficit, it means that its expenditure is exceeding its revenue. What it is collecting doesn't match what it is expending. And then a budget surplus simply means the revenues exceed the expenditure. So we are spending more, what we are spending is what we are collecting exceeds what we are spending. So each of these choices have different development implications. So if you're living within deficits, you're living beyond your means, you're spending today and living the consequences for the future. If you're having a balanced budget, you're being neutral between the current generation and the future generation. If you're living within a surplus, you're exceeding the constitutional requirement. You're exceeding the constitutional requirement under Article 201C. And I'll read that for you so that you understand why that is important. And the article says, the burdens and benefits of the use of resources and public borrowing shall be shared equitably between present and future generations, right? So having understood what debt position, what budget positions a country could have, we'll now look at why governments run deficits. And this is a bit too obvious. A country runs deficit to finance infrastructure and social services. And that is why, again, the borrowing comes in, because now it cannot sustain infrastructure development and social service delivery. So it has to go out of its way and borrow so that it meets these obligations. And then, of course, to respond to shocks. We saw what happened when COVID-19 happened. So that we were able to handle that crisis at that time, the government had to borrow so that it could handle that. And then, of course, for obvious reasons, bridging revenue shortfalls. When your revenues, when your expenditures are higher than your revenues, it means you don't have enough to support your service delivery and your spending. So you have to borrow to bridge that gap. Let's look at budget deficits. And is it really realistic when a country is when you're speaking of a country that is running a balanced budget? It simply means the revenues and the expenditures are at the same level. So the revenue is, for example, 100 shillings, and what they're spending is 100 shillings. So if a government wants to run a balanced budget, if they are having a budget of, for example, 1 trillion, it therefore means that the revenue collected has to be 1 trillion. What are the pros of having a balanced budget? So the pros of having a balanced budget allows for fiscal discipline and debt containment. So you're living within your means. So you're not going to have to go out of your way to borrow so that you can meet certain obligations. You're working with what you have, and it lowers your borrowing needs as explained, and then it improves investor confidence because your debt levels are managed and probably not even there because you're living without your means. What you you've collected is what you're spending. But it also comes not without its cons. So the cons, for example, we have limited flexibility during economic downturns. So you don't have the fiscal space for budget adjustments because you're spending exactly what you have. So if you're hit by a shock, you do not have extra to go to handle whatever shock. And then there's a risk of underfunding critical public services. So that means because you're living within your means, if you have a budget, for instance, of for the health sector of 3 billion, and you can't afford to have that 3 billion, that means that budget has to be shrunk so that it is within the total budget does not surpass. So there are certain services that then will have to experience budget shrinks. And then it slows down economic recovery if applied rigidly. Let's look at budget surpluses. So the budget surpluses, for example, it's very rare. And it is rare because this simply means you are collecting more than you're spending. Right? So this can only be achieved if, one, you have very strong revenue growth. And within that revenue growth, your spending is also very restrained. And your constitution or your legal obligation is also pushing you towards having a budget surplus. And we've seen even within Kenya's constitution, there is a provision. It does not necessarily tie us to having a budget surplus, but it is tying us to not burdening the future generation. And not burdening the future generation either means we are having a surplus or our budgets are balanced. We are not borrowing, right? And so just for clarity, there are certain countries that actually have budget surpluses. And most countries that have budget surpluses are countries that have huge natural resources and their population is not so big. So you'll have an example of Qatar, you'll have an example of Kuwait. And also, if you look at these countries, they also have very serious fiscal discipline. And my colleague, Jairus will be taking us through an example of Singapore, whose fiscal discipline is very, very strong, and he will be giving us that example. So let's when a country has budget surpluses, it helps in reducing borrowing. So their debt levels are reduced. And on the other hand, while the debt levels are reduced, there's increased social and political pressures, because now you'll find probably a higher demand for better provision of social services, and then the political conversations would be very, very different because there's extra money to be spent, for example, right? Now, we've taken you through the three different budget options a country can have. That's a balanced budget, having a budget deficit, or having a budget surplus. Now, we want us now to go into a conversation and look at Kenya's reality. And on your screen, you're seeing a chart that is giving us what Kenya's budget looks like. So you can clearly tell between 2000 and 2006, Kenya is running consistent budget deficits, which means there is borrowing going on to handle service provision. So as it's today, Kenya's total budget is at 12.6 trillion. Of that 12.6 trillion, 6.6 is 6.7 roughly is from domestic, is serviced through domestic borrowing, and 5.6 is external debt. So cumulatively, it comes to about 12.3 trillion. And probably you're wondering why we are looking at it. So we have Moi, Kibaki, Uhuru, and Ruto. We have that because for us, we strongly believe that the debt conversation is also as a result of political consequences, political decisions that were made by the different regimes. So if you look at it, it has been growing very, very steadily since 2000, all the way from Moi regime to the Ruto regime. The debt has been growing. If we look at it in terms which I've explained from the previous, you see that deficits are largely financed from domestic and external borrowing. And during between 2000 and 2005, you notice that there was 2005, you notice that the borrowing was more towards external borrowing. Then between 2003 all the way to 2013 thereabout, the borrowing went lower to more of it was from external borrowing, though it reduced. It started high on external and then came down to more domestic than external. Then the next regime between 2013 all the way to the present, we see there is more external borrowing as opposed to there's more domestic borrowing as opposed to external borrowing. And as present, the total debt owed is 54.4 of it is owed domestically to domestic lenders, and 45.6 is owed to external lenders. Again, this is still distribution of public debt to GDP across the different political administrations, pointing back to why we are still saying the fiscal policy is a political choice. So you notice that from 2013, there is an escalation, which is a pointer to a growing debt as a share of GDP. That means debt is growing faster than GDP. And if we have that conversation considering the primary balance, we notice that the primary balance is going more towards the negative direction. And what is the implication of this? The implication of this is that the rising debt servicing costs crowds out development spending and transfers the cost to future generations. So we are borrowing now, spending today, but the costs are being borne by the future generations. Having looked at Kenya's reality, you notice that Kenya's debt problem is surrounded by growth and primary balance issues. So we asked ourselves, what we had a look at Kenya's peers. So if you have an opportunity to read an article that my colleagues, a paper that my colleagues did, and then floods, you'll encounter this chart. And this chart just shows Kenya's peers' growth relative to Kenya. And how did we pick on this on these particular peers we will be speaking about? So these 8 peers were picked because they were close to Kenya's average income levels at that time, which is 1990. And so of all those countries that were within Kenya's income level, we asked ourselves which countries were performing well in terms of growth. And a lot of our neighbors fell off, but these 8 countries, that's Vietnam, Bhutan, Laos, PDR, Cape Verde, Cambodia, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal were performing pretty well. And if you look at this chart, it is a clear pointer that as compared to the 8 peers, Kenya's growth has really not performed well. So the growth of our peers, as at 2024, was 8% per year for the 30 years, while that of Kenya was 4%. So if Kenya was performing at the same pace, at the same rate, if it was growing at the same rate as its peers, then our current economy would be 4 times larger than what it is today. So that's why this chart is very important, so that we see at 1990, how are our peers performing within the same, peers who are within the same income levels, how are they performing? And then steadily, how have they performed? And the chart clearly shows you Kenya was even higher than some of them. And then they've surpassed us and done well in terms of growth. We mentioned about primary balance. So what is primary balance? So primary balance is simply the balance in the total debt servicing minus the interest payments. So the best peer band is usually between 0 to -2. And so you see our peers, the box on the graph just shows where the 8 peers are as far as a primary balanced budget is. And then the red line shows where Kenya is. And you notice that Kenya is mostly out of the best peer band within the 30 years that were reviewed, which signifies that the budgets have been too tight or too loose. And when we are speaking of a budget that is too tight, what we are saying is the government is reducing on its public spending. And when we speak of a budget that is too loose, then it means the government is accumulating more debt, meaning the revenues are not matching the expenditures. So in a nutshell, we wanted to show you why we feel that as we are having the debt conversation, we need to have it including the growth, the country's growth and its primary balance. So as we move on to the next slide, which my colleague will be sharing on what Kenya really needs, we will now understand why the growth question and the primary balance question, again, is of essence. So I'll hand this over back to Kwame.
Okay. Thanks, Winnie, for the presentation. We'll pass. So Winnie has given us the introductory part, which is basically a definition of terms and the state of play for Kenya. So we'll go now to Jairus, who will make the second part of the presentation. Jairus, you have 15 minutes as well.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Kwame, and thanks, Winnie. So having understood our history, Winnie has taken us through our
Jairus, you're on mute.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, Jairus.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks, Winnie, for taking
We
us
still can't
through
hear you.
the first
Jairus,
part.
we can't hear you.
Just as confirm, can you hear me? I hope I'm audible and I can continue. Okay, thank you, thank you. So thanks, Winnie, for taking us through the history of Kenya in relation to budgets and dates. And therefore, having understood that history, our policy options on budgets, our choices that we've embraced over the years, and taken us through that case study from and then floods. Now, at this point, we want to understand what option or what does Kenya need now? Of the three options that we have, then how should we progress from here? And we have the three. We can have deficit budgets, what we've been doing consistently for many years. We can do a surplus budget or a balanced budget. And we are not saying that, okay, a surplus budget is desirable, because that means that we are actually not only living within our means, but also we have some savings for future generations, that we are not passing debt costs to future generations. Then we need a credible medium fiscal strategy at this time. And this will be important because this will address deficits, that's gradually reduce deficits. As my colleague has shown, we are doing, our deficit position is bad because it's actually above a band, the 0 to -2 band, that would be consistent with our peers while maintaining economic growth. So we are not saying that we need to immediately move away from deficits and go and transit into surplus budgets, but we are saying we can have a gradual reduction of deficits and therefore fall within that band that should be able to support growth, economic growth, while managing our debt. And we're not saying that government now should stop spending on social and develop the social sector and other development infrastructure projects. We are saying that still managing our deficits through balanced budgets will be able still to provide room for government to be able to spend on social sector. One thing that has been argued for a very long time is improving budget spending efficiency. And this, we have evidence for this. You can see many examples from the audit reports. And the good thing with the audit reports is that we have recommendations at the end. And again, these recommendations are sent to Parliament. Therefore, if we implement these recommendations, we are able to achieve spending efficiency. Currently, we've seen efforts to raise revenue, and if you look at the revenue statements, we are making some improvement in raising more revenue, which is a good thing. And we are saying that increasing or strengthening more revenue mobilization efforts will ensure that we have higher revenues, or we increase our revenues, and therefore be able to move closer to our spending and therefore reduce the deficits. So our road now, our goal at the moment will be to have a balanced budget in the medium term. And if we manage to get that and move to a surplus budget in future, that will be well and good. So in our next slide, we are looking at a country that we all love, our politicians and ourselves. I think it's only football fans who don't Singapore a lot, but our politicians and Kenyans really love this country. So here we have, this chart shows you the budget aggregates, that's revenue, expenditure, and budget, and the balances between the year 2000 and 2023, which is very recent, and it's a long trend which can show us actually the behavior of this country when it comes to budgets. So the blue lines shows us the revenue. The green one, I think that's green, that's the overall expenditure as a share of GDP. And that line that you see below there shows us the fiscal balance. That's the difference between expenditure and revenues. So if you look from the chart clearly shows that from 2000, if you read through, you'll be able to see instances where the blue line is above the green one, indicating that actually the country has run surpluses at some point. An outlier here is the year 2020, and that was the COVID period, where expenditures went far ahead compared to revenues. But again, a keen eye will tell you that immediately the following year, they are back to balanced budgets. Something else you can see here is that the expenditure is mostly actually falls between below 20% of GDP, which is around, for the last 2023, that's the last year, that was about around 18%. And you can see the green one, which also is below, just closer to the blue one, again shows you that the tax burden in the country is not that big. So if Singapore could do this for all these years, 20 years, and why is it this possible? How have they managed to keep themselves within this band? So when you go to our next slide, you'll be able to get some of the reasons to understand how they were able to achieve this. My colleague has just read to you an article from our Constitution 2010. In addition, actually, we have a whole chapter on public finance. In addition, we have the Public Finance Management Act, both at the national level and county level. and regulations on the same. But then there's a difference that we can see between Kenya and Singapore, and maybe that's its discipline. Number one, we can see from here that Singapore has the requirement for a balanced budget in the constitution. So the constitution mandates that in that term of government, which is 5 years like us, government cannot run on deficits. So we could have, as we have seen in the previous slide, we could have years of deficits, but now we'll have to compensate for that before the term of the year, before the term of that government. That's 5 years. So we'll have a balanced budget, which we have deficits being cancelled by surpluses in the years that follow. So that's a constitutional requirement that we have balanced budgets within that term. I think we have some of these ideas that we need to have budgets that respond to our needs. And as my colleague has read, we must, that's Article 2.1, we must consider future generations so that we don't pass costs or burdens of debt repayment to future generations. And therefore that actually points to the same thing as indicated here. And while we are not endowed with a lot of resources that will give us the advantage, we could live within our means. And in addition to that, balanced budgets, what's interesting with Singapore is that same for us here, but Parliament has the role to approve budgets. And therefore, we could experience that here. We could have that in our case where Parliament carefully scrutinizes the budgets, look at the expenditure and the revenue sides. And where we have large differences, which means maybe going into the market to borrow more, Parliament could reject that and insist that we have a balanced budget, or we reduce those differences, those margins. In Singapore, the president actually can veto some of these ideas in budgets, where we have the indication of requiring maybe to borrow more, or to go into our reserves that are not been accumulated within that term of government. So Parliament might approve, and then the president in his wisdom decides, no, we are not going to invade reserves that have been accumulated in the previous term, because actually they are protected by the Constitution. And in addition to this, as we have said this many times, we must have prudence in expenditures. We must be able to carefully manage our resources and therefore avoid wastage. And therefore, with that, I think we can be able to follow this example of Singapore. Another thing in our next slide, another thing that we see here, which we should copy from Singapore the same way we want to copy the other good things, is on that first point that you see, that each generation, that's benefiter pays. Each generation pays for whatever they benefit. So for some time, as you've been taken through the history, the period where we had a lot of borrowing, when growth in public debt went up so fast, actually was a period, that period of fiscal expansion. There was this excuse that we were investing in infrastructure projects. But again, there's this question that will always come. Are these projects that we are choosing the best for a country? Like, how did we decide that this is what actually the country wants, and this is what the future generations will want? So we borrow, and then pass those costs to the future generations. As we can see from the data that we have shared earlier, we are spending a big chunk of our resources today, a big chunk of our revenues today into servicing debts that were borrowed in previous regimes. If we follow this example, or if we copied this good behavior from Singapore, then that means we only live within our means. We don't pass costs that's of debt servicing to the generations that come next. And therefore, this places again our parliament and the executive into focus, that we have these constitutional principles. Actually, we have a good constitution that speaks on public finance and the Public Finance Act. And those violations that happen without punishment, I think that's where we need to revisit. And therefore, we are calling again on Parliament and the executive to be able to consider these fiscal rules that have been set as not options, but as guides that will ensure that we're able to implement to achieve balanced budgets within the medium term. Now, next slide. So therefore, as I've already mentioned, what are the policy options for the country at the moment? Because we have said in the medium term, we would want to have a balanced budget. We are not saying that strictly revenues balancing with expenditure, but we have been reduced that deficit to the extent that the balance is balanced, and we are not sending other costs to future years. So therefore, Parliament must take a stronger stance on reducing public debt, and that can be done through the established mechanisms of law. If you can remember very well, just a few years when our debt anchor was as a percentage of the GDP, we kept, as a ceiling, a budget ceiling, a debt ceiling. Very often the government, Parliament would be called upon to raise that ceiling upwards. After that, now they have shifted to another anchor that's a percentage of GDP in present value, which again still we've surpassed. And if you look at the spending pattern that we have, which Parliament approves, still we are going to have, it's going to take us longer than required to bring that debt within manageable, sustainable levels. Reprioritizing our expenditure towards growth-enhancing sectors will be very important, as again, we reiterate, this does not mean that government stops funding key social sectors. Growth-enhancing sectors, like, for example, my colleagues here have done some paper on, and actually held some conversations also on white elephant projects. When our expenditure, lots of expenditures go into projects with no returns, or which will take a very long time for us to experience those benefits, then that will be like delaying our growth. Containing spending both in recurrent and development, that will be very, and these actually, some of these are in our fiscal rules. If you check our PFM regulations, we have limits on recurrent expenditure, we have limits on salaries and wages. And therefore, if these rules that we have now, if Parliament follows it up to enforce, then we could be on our way to, we actually will be on our way to realizing balanced budgets and reducing the burden of debt. Debt management still remains a challenge. While we have data being published regularly about our public debt, which is a sign of transparency, but I think there could be more on the same. A few years ago, we had an audit on our Eurobond proceeds. First, one big challenge was that we could not account for that having received all the money. So we have gaps on transparency. Secondly, while we said that some of this money went into financing projects, there were no projects that we could identify and say this was funded by Eurobond proceeds and what. So we need to have increased transparency and accountability in our debt and raise our debt management so that we achieve sustainability. Thank you. Back to you, Kwame.
All right. Thanks, Justice. Jairus. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot. What we're discussing today was about basically debt in general, but not just debt, because I think the debt question, many of you will say, has been probably spunked to death. Regardless of that, I think we need to come every day because it's salient. Even this year's budget, I mean, the next financial year's budget arrangement will be against the background of the fact that the debt question is the predominant issue that is dealt with. The largest proportion of expenditure, as you understand, for this year was basically that government is spending more on paying for debt. Remember, this is not money that was lost. This is money that was accumulated earlier through deficits. And so last year, this financial year, government is spending more on debt servicing than on health and education put together. And those are the biggest services that government provides. So what the conclusion that leads us to is when you hear people say things such as debt is not bad, I think that's perhaps a trick. Deficits matter a lot. Remember, debt cannot be controlled. What you can control is your deficit, because once you've procured debt, once you've acquired, you have a deficit, which leads to debt. It piles up into what becomes the momentum for debt, as we can see. And we've been on this momentum for the last 30 years, but more especially in the last 15, when there was an escalation in fiscal expansion. So that's one. So deficits matter. And because deficits matter, we know the country of Singapore, whom we mirror against, decided that deficits matter, and therefore passed a constitutional article which specifically requires that every government balances the budget within its term. Every government, every administration rather. So balanced budget initiative is one thing that could correct for us. And it's not necessarily the reduction of debt, it's basically a balanced budget initiative. So that's the first. The core metric for understanding debt is from debt to GDP to the primary balance. So it doesn't matter how GDP is growing. If the debt is growing at a far higher rate than the GDP, then you find yourself that in this year, more money is being used to pay on the primary balances. You find that this year, the government of Kenya has obligations to pay interest rates that is higher than paying for the principal. And you know when that happens and is sustained, we are in deep trouble. So the trouble stays. I think we cannot address debt independent of Kenya's growth. And one of the slides that Winnie showed us was one that showed that over a 30-year period, measured in the Kenya's per capita income measured in US dollar terms, 2017 dollars, shows that while all of us say that Kenya's income, we have a 5%, 4.85% average growth over that time, the real growth rate for Kenya is just about 1%. Very slow. And at that pace, it is unlikely that this debt problem can be resolved very easily, at the same time as meeting the obligations that and the appetite for expenditure that the government of Kenya has. So Kenya's debt problem is both a reflection of poor management of the primary balance, it's outside the best peer practice, and at the same time, Kenya has a growth problem, and that's what admitting to. And the final thing is that Parliament should aim for a balanced budget in the medium term, actually. Achieving a balanced budget and pushing the decision-making power that it has towards a balanced budget is something that we think Parliament ought to take more seriously. Because if you can see, we've had a generation of debt accumulation, and we always go into this indisciplined phases of fiscal expansion on one side, huge fiscal expansion, then we are forced to go into austerity, and that balance and that kind of fluctuation is not good for growth either. So a growth-facing fiscal policy is essential, and a growth-facing fiscal policy is not the same as saying the government should borrow as much as it wants to. I think that's one thing in our view. In light of the fact that one interpretation of balancing the burdens and benefits of fiscal policy is to ensure that you balance it intergenerational balancing. As it is right now, the existing generation, represented by the administration that has been in office, is giving future generations a really bad deal. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we open up for any questions and answers. And the way to do that is I'll allow you to either raise your hand. The menu bar at the toolbar right at the top, floating toolbar, allows you to raise your hand, and I'll pick up I'll call out your name and you can answer that question. Or if you wish not to, you can send your question through the Q&A box or the chat box that's also available. I'll read them out. So let's start with Diana. Yes, Diana, please ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kwame. So I was just, I just wanted to ask around the issue of inheriting of fiscal budgets from previous government. And if you listen to our current cabinet secretary in his last intervention during the medium-term debt strategy, he said that this government inherited a lot of deficits and hence the huge appetite of borrowing. So maybe addressing that. And then the importance of having a debt audit, it cannot be understated. There's this, Okiya Omtata already petitioned for an odious debt legislation where the government needs to look at debts that we are servicing which are odious. That is, we are not supposed to be paying. So maybe your opinion on that. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Diana. Any other questions on let me see whether there's a question in the Q&A. Oh, one other, okay. So let's have Christine Yahama. Christine, please switch on your mic, unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwame and the team. Mine is not a question, but it's for Jairus. He was explaining something on the road to a balanced budget in the medium term, whereby he showed us the Singapore budget. I just wanted him just to repeat for me, because I'll really look at that the pictures he has shared. He has said blue means revenue, and then the black, the fiscal balance. Maybe you could just remind me about the green color kindly. Thank you.
All right, that's fine. We have a question from Moses. Moses as well, please.
I hope you can hear me. So I have a comment and then a question. This is especially on targeting to have a balanced budget in the medium term. Well, from our debt projection, it shows that the situation we are in will probably remain the same for a bit of time. And therefore, that constrains the idea that we can actually balance our budget in the medium term. Well, maybe you have a way that can be done. But given the evidence that you showed that our best peers also do not maintain necessarily a balanced budget, and they have been able to achieve a certain level of growth, which is desirable to be achieved by us, then why is the balanced budget the best alternative for us? Thanks.
All right. So I'll have Sophie and then we'll come back.
Good morning. Thank you, Kwame and team. I'm not sure if
Sophie, could you ask your question?
You can hear me? Hello?
Yes, you can.
Yes.
We can hear you, please.
Thank you. My question regards the direction that the government is taking, where they're repeatedly talking about.
Sophie, are you there?
Yes, I believe I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you, Sophie.
Yeah, the government is increasingly securitizing levies as they seek to build infrastructure. So if you could just comment on that and the fact that they have indicated this securitization does not qualify to be counted as debt. What will be the long-term effect of this, as well as the new direction the government is also taking, whereby through the sale of assets, they are looking to build an infrastructure and a wealth fund. How will that impact our debt position? Thank you.
Okay, all right, that's fine. So I'll come back to our presenters for question and answers. And this time I'll reverse the order. So I'll start with Jairus. Jairus, there was a question specifically especially by Christine about, so can we have the presentation back in so that you can illustrate what you can illustrate the chart.
That's slide 13.
Yeah.
Slide 14.
I think she was talking about the green red. Okay, fine. Go ahead now.
Yes. So I'll start with this question by Christine. Okay, the chart that we have on our screens shows us that budget aggregates for Singapore between 2000 and 2023. We have a key up there. Total revenue is in blue. In the middle, we have the overall expenditure. That's the overall government expenditure, the green one. And that line that you can see below there, now that shows us the fiscal balance. That's the difference between the revenues at that time and the total government expenditure as a share of GDP at that time. We can share these documents so that you're able to look at it, but I hope with the key and that explanation, then that's clear. And actually what this shows is that in some years, we had, in some years, the budget, there were budget surpluses where you have more revenue compared to government expenditure. And in 2020, which is actually an outlier here, where total government expenditure was much higher compared to the revenues. And you can see that in the fiscal, that graph showing the fiscal balance, which actually went to about 10 or 11% of GDP. But again, we are saying this is a balanced budget because if you look at we have those deficits and surpluses which cancel out. And because it's a constitutional requirement for them, then that must be adhered to. And actually for them, I think before they bring in the issues of two-term, they use this as an evaluation of government. If the government does not comply to this constitutional requirement, then I think two-term becomes hard. So I hope that's clear. To Diana, you are asking about a comment by the CS on inheriting fiscal budgets. Our current CS has served in the National Assembly for several years. And actually he was part of the team that were considering budgets, mostly approving. After a few months, 6 months or less, they were also given an opportunity to review the same budgets and mostly through supplementary budgets. And we can look at those documents and see the behavior of Parliament in terms of scrutiny and whether even those the rules in place, if they are being considered in adjusting those budgets. So it's true, yes, that we've had that challenge. I'll call it a challenge, but I think Parliament doesn't see that as a challenge, whereby we are passing fiscal budget deficits from one year to the other, one administration to the other, and to the future generations. And that's actually, if you go back to our charts, showing our public debt, that the trend on our public debt, actually we are borrowing more. Even the pace of borrowing has increased. And the big challenge, as Kwame has also explained while giving the conclusion, is that our debt is growing at a higher rate compared to our economic growth. And that's why you see that. So if actually we strengthen our desire, or we put measures to ensure that we can have sustainable growth at a higher rate than the public debt, then we will be able to reduce that in several years. So Parliament, I think if Parliament takes its role seriously on scrutiny of budgets and insisting on reducing these fiscal balances, then we'll be on our road to balanced budgets. Moses, you had a comment on our debt projections, and if we could achieve balanced budgets within the medium term, that would be tricky. But again, I think our focus now is on the budgets. Like at the moment, we're looking at 2026, 2027. If we could start there, whereby we are reducing that primary balance, that will be a good start for the country, and that again we are placing that on Parliament to look at that. And because our biggest challenge today is debt servicing, and as that has been mentioned before, our debt servicing now is about that includes that includes the interest payments and the principal. The principal, the interest payments alone in this current financial year is over $1 billion. Of course, dominated by domestic interest on domestic debt. And I think on this, if we go back to the work done by our colleagues, then floods, I mean, if you keep doing, which came after and then floods, they recommend debt default. And in many other conversations, we had these suggestions for restructuring, which the government has tried to do with the Eurobonds. But again, because that's just pushing that the interest, that obligation into future generations, we must address the growth problem to be able to have an economy that will be able to accommodate that debt and repay. And lastly, on securitizing levies, I think Kwame will be in a better position to comment on this. But again, this is what I'll say. I think even if the government, the executive and Parliament try to run away from the fact that securitizing, if we're going to receive that money in advance, still that will count as public debt. And I hope Parliament will be able to stick out their necks so that we don't lose this transparency on our public debt through any other circumvention of our rules or our laws on transparency and debt management. That's okay. That's all from me. Thank you. Winnie?
All right, thank you, Jairus, for that. So I'll answer. Moses asked why is a balanced budget the best alternative? And I'll still stick to this, the chart that is on your screen. We are thinking the Singapore direction. And if you look at the Singapore direction, it started with balanced deficits. And then in 2008, it moved to a balanced budget and then progressed. So we have to start from somewhere. So in as much as right now we're working with deficits, our main push is for us to now work towards having a balanced budget, which then will move us from balanced budgets to now having a budget surplus. So yes, it's just where we are starting from. And if you further look at the Singapore example, it is a constitutional requirement to keep a balanced budget for them. And for us in Kenya, it is a constitutional requirement that the burdens and benefits of the use of resources and public borrowing shall be shared equitably between present and future generations. So if this current generation, it should only pay for what it is spending, it should only pay for what it is benefiting from, so that we are not we are not charging the future generations with that debt conversation. So I hope that answers. And then with the debt growing, will Kenya be like Singapore? The simple answer is no. Singapore is currently operating on a surplus. So it would be an ambitious conversation for us to continue running on this budget deficits and then have a conversation of being a Singapore, a country that is operating on a surplus, meaning it is collecting more than it is spending. So if we want to be like Singapore, it is a clear pointer. We need to push our revenues and reduce on our expenditures. And if we cannot get ourselves to that point, then let's start at a point of matching our revenues to our expenditures. And then, of course, Kwame will be speaking about securitizing of levies. But the big question that we will be having is, when you're speaking levies, what you are doing is you're borrowing against future income. And if you're borrowing against future income, what you are doing is clearly getting yourself into a type of debt. So of course, Kwame will elaborate more, but I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
All right. Okay, maybe I should try and answer those questions right now. So there are two questions that, Diana, I think you did. Pierce Body is very important, but I don't think it's right for him to say, so we have to be careful. There's no government that inherits deficits, because the deficit is the balance on a year-by-year basis. You can only inherit a debt. Deficits are the choices that government makes. So if Mali said they inherited deficits, I think he meant they inherited the debt, a given stock of debt. Because remember, a deficit is the budget management decision on a year-by-year basis. The pile-up of the deficits is what leads to the stock of debt. So they inherited a stock of debt that is not equivalent to the deficits. The deficits that we've had last year, in the financial year since CS Bali was nominated, to this year, are basically the choices that were made by the administration for which he works, and therefore that reflects his choices as well. So that's the first one. The second is a question of securitization. Let's understand what securitization is. One of the things that this administration is fluent at is to use big finance terms coming from, Wall Street market financial professionals to bamboozle us, I suspect. But basically, this is what it means. The road maintenance levy was established through an act of parliament, and its function is to ensure the maintenance of roads. So you can construct roads through the budget process, and then you place a levy, which means that when you buy petroleum, a share or a given amount per liter is dedicated to the maintenance of roads. What has this administration done? Now, by securitization, what it means is it says that, look, because we have the road maintenance levy, which is also a tax, though it's a levy that comes from those who use roads, who buy petroleum. Now, because we have this assured revenue because of this law, law that allows for the collection of road maintenance levy, we will borrow money and pay for that, spend that money today, and assure whoever is lending us that that money will be paid. That loan and the interest thereon will be paid from the money that we collect over the future. So what that means is you've taken road maintenance funds that were meant for road maintenance, spent it today, and ensure that in the future, that money will be used already. So that means you're already in debt because you've taken future income and spent it today. So they may be clever and say things like that, but the effect is they're actually charging existing resources, including the future ones, and using it for expenditures today. So that's a problem. The second thing about the contingent securitization is when you say that road maintenance levy is already being charged and you're using it to construct or maintain today's roads, and claimed it and actually borrowed on account of that, you're making a certain assumption that the road maintenance levy will continue to exist. You're actually tying Parliament's hands so that it cannot, even if we citizens voted for it, Parliament cannot take away the road maintenance levy, because if they do, that obligation then falls to government, which means it's a new debt. That's basically what has happened. So we can call them different names, but the consequences is that it does not reduce public liability. The third one is what is called contingent liability. If, for instance, the road maintenance levy is insufficient, these loans that are being taken will fall immediately as part of the public debt, because that obligation and that liability will have to be paid for from the private sector. So there's nothing clever that these people have done. They've gotten good lawyers to write contracts. They've gotten certain firms to actually be assured of income. And they've probably negotiated very eye-watering interest rates for these guys. But what they've done is simply switched it, and basically means taking the future. It's like a person who's actually consumed today what would have been a future harvest. That's borrowing by every other name. And that's precisely what we should call it, because it still introduces that risk, but it means there's an opportunity cost in the future. That income has already been claimed, and therefore maintaining future roads will have to take place through other resources. So it is not debt by virtue of the way it is procured, as it is procured today through a deficit, but it is still debt because the government still holds the bag. And if it fails to come through, the taxpayer will be paying whichever way, whether you pay through it through the road maintenance levy or whether you pay for it as a contingent liability. I think that's important for us to is important for us to consider. I'll go to the second round of events, but in a second round of questions. But the other questions that have been asked, there's a question from Courier in which he asks, in what regard is the public debt considered perpetual? And how does this affect the state of the economy? It's an interesting question. It's very interesting as well. And then Christine gives a thanks Jairus for the question and answering it clearly. And then Christine asks again, sorry to ask, zero budgeting and balanced budget, can it work in the Kenyan context? Can the zero budgeting and balanced budget work in the Kenyan context? And I don't know whether anybody else has a question. Please raise your hands, because this is the last set of questions so that we can complete this conversation on time. We're a little bit ahead of time, but basically so we can see. Because they're not here, we don't have any more questions, and I haven't seen any hands up. I'll come this time and we will start. So you can answer Courier's question together with Christine's and make any other comments for things that have not been answered about balanced budgets and zero budgeting. Winnie?
Okay, so in asking, Christine is asking, Winnie, sorry to ask, zero budgeting and balanced budgets, can it work in the Kenyan context? I think it should work in the Kenyan context. Why? Because having a balanced budget just entails cutting your coat according to your size. So the Kenyan government should just admit this is the level of revenue they are collecting, and so that revenue they have collected is what they should spend. But first things first, given the high debt level that Kenya is swimming in currently, it would therefore mean that we first work towards reducing that budget, the budget deficits we have, then slowly work towards a balanced budget. Because as is, the budget levels are very high, and the revenue collected. And the one thing we should know as we're having this conversation is the revenue collection is not a problem for Kenya. The debt issue, the money problems in Kenya are not about the revenue collected, because if you look at the revenue reports, Kenya has been trying to improve its revenue collection, but then the problem comes with the expenditure. The budgets are continuously on the rise, without putting into consideration that in as much as the revenue is increasing, it is not sufficient for the budgets that are produced by Treasury. So that is something that they need to work on. So first things first, let's work on our debt. Let's reduce the levels. Then once we are in a position where we can say where we are saying our levels are at a manageable level, then now let's push ourselves towards having balanced budgets. And balanced budgets are just simple. match our revenues collection to our expenditure, or rather match our expenditures to our revenue collections, so that we are not having to borrow outside. Cut your coat according to your size. So basically, Christine, I think if you go in that direction, we should be able to get ourselves to that. So I think that's what I will answer to. Thank you.
All right, Jairus.
Okay, thank you. On the question asked by Kuria on perpetual dates, as we've indicated earlier in our presentation, how does this date come about? The fiscal balance. Our expenditures are higher compared to our revenue. And so every year we have gaps in financing our budgets. So if we are doing that for over 20 years, actually we've done that for a very long period, that means every year we have to borrow to finance our budget. So that means if every year we are planning to spend more than we are planning to collect, we're going to have to borrow every year. That's perpetual debt. Look at it in this way again. So we have besides that fiscal balance, now we have even revenue shortfalls that happen almost actually every year, which sometimes are expanded through our supplementary budgets. And where does the problem begin? At planning, where we set our targets higher, our revenue targets, than even the reality that we have. So you set your target at 2.5 trillion in the 12 months. At the end of the year, you've collected less than 2 trillion. Again, your fiscal balance expands, because unless now you cut on your expenditure, you are still increasing your fiscal balance and therefore your debt. Does this have an effect? Does debt has an effect on our growth? I think that's the second part of your question, and I'll take two angles to this. We are seeing in this current financial year, we are spending over 1 trillion on debt servicing, on debt interest. That means the 1 trillion is not available for government expenditure in other sectors. And what does that mean? We have delayed disbursement of funds to counties. So we might have strikes in our hospitals that are run by counties, delayed capitation, and then maybe at the end of the financial year, we say, we do not remember that we have that schools had accumulated debts because we delayed to send money. And again, for university students, now we start asking, should we reduce the amounts we are giving in scholarships and loans, or what? And therefore we generate other issues, other crises. On the other hand, borrowing itself, when government now goes to borrow, especially domestic borrowing, is crowding out the private sector. What do we know? The private sector is a very important player in economic development and economic growth. So private sector does not have access to credit. Their investment, they have to revise their expansion plans, and that will have an effect on economic growth. And so I think, yes, government debt, public debt, on the side of borrowing, at the level of borrowing in the beginning, that has a problem on economic growth, because that means resources that the private sector is crowded out. And then in debt servicing, we are seeing that, yes, this amount that we are using now to service our debt is not available for other investments that would spur economic growth. That is it from me. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Now I have James Ndungu. James Ndungu has a question. Let me have all the other questions so that we can close the meeting with final comments and the other questions. There are pending questions here. James, please ask your question so that we can have Jairus and there's another question on the prudence. How to bridge the gap between policies and politics and implementation. I don't know that that's relevant for today's meeting, but basically my colleagues can each take that. But she's asking how to bridge the gap between policies and politics, policies and implementation. Okay, that's one. Any other question? I see that James has a question. James, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And thank you so much for the series of presentations. I've been following the forums, the webinars.
Okay, looks like...
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, now I wanted as maybe, this is not necessarily a question, but the discussion today was very good because we are talking about the deficit. But I would also want us now to proceed and check why are these deficits arising, and we've delved into the issue of revenues, and maybe it's not a revenue issue, it's an expenditure issue. And then we go to the point that our budgets are being used almost 80% on recurrent expenditure and just 20% on development expenditure. At the end of the financial year, it's the development expenditure that suffers. When there's a deficit, the money that was supposed to go to development is the one that suffers. The one for recurrent doesn't suffer. Now it brings us to the question, what is this being spent on recurrent that is sending us into the deficits? I would want us to interrogate the element of how we our budget books look like, the itemized budget, where we put our monies into daily subsistence allowance and the others. Actually, we don't do a program-based budget, so that the fund, the revenue that is available in this country, it's still being used on retreats and such things. I think we need to interrogate that so that we can have at least a way forward on this issue about the recurring deficits. Thanks.
Right. So it looks like those are our final questions, Winnie, and those are our final questions. So Winnie and Jairus. So I'll start with Jairus and your final comments as well, and then we'll conclude with Winnie.
Okay, thanks, CPA James Ndungu. Okay, I'll start with your question. I think we'll be able to interrogate this, and but I think also we have done that before, because every financial year we look at budget documents, and that is information is also available in on our website. So if you visit our website, you'll be able to see some publications on budgets. But the point you bring up is very important, and therefore we will do a study on this and maybe do another conversation where actually we will go deeper to understand how our deficits are coming about. Of course, we have already shown that, because we've been able to show that our expenditures are here, and these are our revenues, and therefore we see where that's coming, and therefore tie that to where are we spending. Because if you're spending 80% of our, not just our revenues, but our budgets on recurrent and staffing development projects, which actually is another. We have that in our PFM, where we have at least 30% that should be spent on development. So therefore, that means there's a breach on the rules that we've set, and therefore we need to call out Parliament on that. But we'll go deeper into that and be able to share our findings. Prudence, you asked the question on policy and politics. And when we were projecting that slide on debt by regimes, I think Winnie mentioned that actually our debt is political choices. It's choices that we make at regime level. That before, after the first regime, the Moi regime, we have debt, and actually that could be explained because Now, repaying debt at that time was actually a priority because of the circumstances. And then Kibaki came, the NAC regime could see that change. So actually, yes, we can link politics and these policy choices, especially on public debt, on spending. Every new administration comes and they decide these will be our priorities. What is that? That's a policy decision. That's a policy direction the regime takes. And how are we going to finance that? Our budgets come in. So politics and policy are very interconnected. And I think we can do also another conversation strictly on this, because that actually is not what we wanted to talk about. But again, as we have demonstrated, that's still part of the conversation. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
All right, so thank you, Jairus. And also, just to speak to Prudence, when you're asking how to bridge the gap between politics and policies and politics, I would push you, it's not a conversation for today, but I would push you to read scenarios that we did at the Institute of Economic Affairs, where we were introducing how institutions and policies need to coordinate or need to work together to ensure that we move ourselves in the right direction. So, and as we were sharing our presentation, remember I mentioned that the debt conversation is not only technical, but there is also an element of it being political and the social side of it. And so the political side of it is because where we are today is as a result of political choices that were made by the different political administrations that we have seen. So if you read the Mapping Kenya in 2040 scenarios, you'd be in a position to understand why those two conversations cannot be had independently. We need to have them together so that we are in a good space. And then in terms of why these deficits are arising, of course, you've mentioned that we should have a separate conversations because, I mean, the debt conversation is a conversation that cannot be had in an hour or two. It's a continuous conversation that we need to continue having up until we get to a position where we are saying our debts are at a manageable level, or we are actually having balanced budgets. So at the IEA, we have a saying, progress, not perfection. So even in line with the debt conversation, let's have a progressive conversation that is pushing us in the right direction that we want for Kenya. And then of that, see what else needs to be done. And then just to take us back to the perpetual debt question, I wanted to give an example that sometimes we have seen instances where government, a time for debt repayment is here, and government doesn't have the money. What it does, it borrows from another entity to pay an already existing loan. And the saddest bit about the new borrowing is more often than not, an example of the Eurobond, is we find that the new debt, the interest rate for it is higher than the debt we are actually borrowing to set off. So we find ourselves in a continuous debt cycle. You're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. So out of the frying pan into the fire. So obviously, the debt conversation has to continue until such a time we are saying, now our books are balanced. What conversation pushes us towards a surplus budget? So thank you so much for joining today's conversation. And please feel free to write to us if you have any further questions, and we will be glad to respond. Thank you, Kwame.
And,
right.
And maybe just my last words.
I think I'll add my voice to two questions that were raised, on which I think my colleagues saw. For instance, I think it was Sophie who asked about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So as we've told you, if you have a government that's piling debt and the debt is growing, generation level debt, and therefore burdening future generations, violating the very core of PFM principles, PFM principles commanded by the Constitution in Article 212 201 C and D. Yes, the government of Kenya is out there talking about establishing an infrastructure fund and at the same time establishing a sovereign wealth fund. I mean, that is a contradiction. So for instance, the infrastructure fund will be established or will start from the sale of privatization or divestiture from Safaricom, which will bring in about $1 billion. So this government that is putting $1 billion into an infrastructure fund is on that same year borrowing $10 billion equivalent through the regular budget. So there's no wealth that's being saved, actually. There's no wealth at all to even, and the cost for starting a sovereign wealth fund is completely zero. So the sovereign wealth fund argument is one of those red herrings that the government has sent to us to show seriousness and that we are copying Singapore. But we are copying Singapore in the things that are not even appropriate. I mean, there's going to be an opinion article, and not only an opinion article in the business press, but we also have a webinar that we carried out last year and a blog post on the IEA's website to discuss this question about the sovereign wealth fund. It's a complete red herring and actually a fiscal distraction, as we call it, and as we conclude in that distraction in the sense of distracting from the core question in Kenya today is basically to bring the fiscus into balance. And so establishing a foreign sovereign wealth fund, because this government is very fluent with the language of finance, as we said it, you have securitization, you have a sovereign wealth fund, you have an infrastructure fund, we have capitalization, those big words that they use. It means nothing if it's not affecting the bottom line. And Kenya's bottom line today is very heavily dragged down by the question of public debt. So yes, please look out for that piece as well. But our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs is you are doing nothing by putting $1 billion in a sovereign wealth fund and borrowing $10 billion all in the same year. I'd rather you actually extinguish the debt and borrowed less at 9%. I mean, the 9 billion, that is the balance. So that's one question on the securitization. I think the second question that I would like to lead with is the question of perpetual borrowing. Now, it's true that government, even the government of Singapore, its outlays for debt is very, very low, extremely low. So that's usually not a problem. But the reason it's not a problem is because you can be in perpetual debt, but if your primary balance is below, it means that you're paying your interest rates. I mean, you're paying the interest income, the interest obligations at a far higher rate than new debt is accumulating. Then you'll always have a balance. You'll never have the strict condition which Winnie spoke about, where government is actually spending much more in the core function of government today in Kenya is paying debt, where you're collecting $2.6 trillion, 2.6 trillion shillings, 2 trillion is debt. Where 1.1 trillion is going out to pay for the interest, and about 900 billion is going out to the principal payments. So when you exist for that function, and the amount of money you're using to pay for debt is larger than the total amount you're using to provide healthcare, health spending on the one side, together with the education services, which are government's biggest services in Kenya outside security, but those two actually are bigger than that as well. Then obviously there's nothing that's being done. So you can call it zero budgeting and all those other fancy names, but it doesn't mean anything. And finally, on the question of zero budgeting and balanced budgets, they're not the same thing. So zero budgeting simply means that at the end of every financial year, there's no assumption that you will fund the same things that you funded last year. It means you start on a new slate by asking what is needed this year, so that you do not push expenditures for 1 year or take automatically rolling obligations over years. So it just means every year you would start on a clean slate, but you can start on a clean slate and still have a deficit, right? So that's why we hope that Kenyans concentrate on the deficit, the fiscal deficit, but more specifically on the primary deficit, because the primary deficit tells you to what extent government is shrinking debt as a share of GDP, and the debt burden on overall is reducing. So that was the core thing that we wished to talk about today. But my colleagues have brought something that is, we are not going to have a conversation around public debt when we have a parliament that accommodates everything that the Treasury Secretary, the Cabinet Secretary for the Treasury proposes to spend. So we need to actually start to talk about respecting Article 201 C and D of the Constitution, which are principles for public finance generally, not just establishing budgets. When you are borrowing this amount of money in the name of building infrastructure and chasing the Singapore dream, which is valid, might be valid, is it justifiable to push, buy a train called the SGR, build an expressway called the Moja Expressway, or whatever it is called, Nairobi Expressway, including stretching the SGR into other parts of the country, building all these bridges and those dams that we assume should be built, calling those infrastructure funds, and then burdening future generations. It is also unfair to say that you have a sovereign wealth fund, which we call in the generation fund, they call it the Urithi Fund, in which you're putting money that you've borrowed. So in as much as on the net basis, you might be giving every child 400 shillings in addition in the fund, but you've borrowed 10,000 shillings. So on the net effect, you're actually leaving future generations. So it's about telling the truth to ourselves, and it is not happening unless we have something, legal instrument or a commitment by Parliament to bring budgets every year into balance by ensuring that every generation, and every generation also means largely every generation of Parliament, every term of Parliament, bringing its own budgets to balance, or seeking, where possible, a surplus so that you can give future generations. But otherwise, what we're doing right now is never going to extinguish the public debt. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are thankful for you being here with us and for the views that you've given to us. Oh, there's one more question. Let me see. Hussein asks, how will new terms, new global view of US dominance on hemisphere hegemony control affect debt and regime governance structure? I'm not too sure that that's, Hussein, allow us to think about that. We have another webinar tomorrow, our webinar number 3 of the year, in which we are discussing the big question of education. You've seen the question of education debate. Kenya is undergoing significant education reforms, and this is the first year in which we're having grade 9s. We have the junior secondary school kids. It has generated debate of its own, but one of the things that we hope to do with the webinar, which takes place tomorrow from 11 o'clock, is to ask ourselves, what's the state of the public school infrastructure, what's the state of the demand and supply side of schools, and whether the debates about who should sit in which geography for their education is a relevant one. So please join us tomorrow. Please join us tomorrow. Oh, Timothy Kiao. Wow. We need to close. Timothy, the point you are making in one of the slides, and that's why we should be keeping the slides on. The point you were making with one of the slides here on Kenya's growth against its peers was, if you consider from the year 1990 to the year 2024, right? That's a 34-year period. Kenya's annual growth rate measured in US dollars, in a standard US dollars, then Kenya's cumulative growth over those 30 years, to the slide before, slide 10. Kenya's cumulative growth over those years is equivalent to a growth rate of 1% a year. I hope that's clear. In the income, basically you're saying that Kenya's income per person growth is equivalent to 1% growth per year. At that growth rate, the income will only double after 72 years. So Kenya has both a growth problem and a debt problem. And that's why the debt as a share of GDP is not shrinking as quickly as is possible, all at the same time that we think the government doesn't have sufficient resources to cover the development needs that we. But if you want to see what that means, please go back to, and then floods, I think, which was provided as a link in our conversation today. It's available also on our website. Yes, here it is, by Faith Zomo. That link is available, and you'll read to understand what the calculation stated. That stated, I'd like us I'd like to thank my colleagues, Jairus and Winnie, for making this presentation. And thank you very much for all of you for being here for the entire 2 hours of our conversation. I know that this was useful to you, but we still welcome feedback. If you have any feedback about what you learned today and some other questions that you'd like for us to address into the future, to hold conversations with, please send us an email to admin@iea-kenya.or.ke. The IEA is an organization with members. We are growing our membership, and we'd appreciate if you'd give us an opportunity to, if you take an opportunity to be a member, it's available on our website for the subscription. Please consider that as well. But all stated, I'd like all of us to give and to appreciate with a clap my colleagues, Winnie, Justus, and Jairus, who arranged, Michelle, who sent out the invitations to you, to all my other IEA colleagues who are here helping with the background research and also helping us to continue to have this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, we appreciate your great gift of sitting with us and all this, and we know that this has been useful. Please The function here is to expand Kenyans, the understanding of Kenyans of what the development challenges are, what policy choices government is making, the consequences of those choices. Also, we can have issue-based political and economic policy discussions in Kenya. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.